Hello, class! Late last night, I was scrolling through Twitter when I came across this preprint, Neurological Imprints of Boys' Love Culture, Shaping Sexual Orientation Identity in the Digital Age's Young Females by Ao et al. Based on the tweets about it, it appeared to be about sexual orientation and gender identity in BL fans. At first, I thought it'd be an interesting thing to talk about. It's a fandom-related thing in psychology. That's kind of what I do. Cool. And then I read the paper. Okay, where to start? So for those of you who are new here and aren't sure why you should trust some weird anime cryptid online to analyze a psychological paper, first, good. You should be wondering that. But let me tell you my qualifications. I have a PhD in psychology, and I've published multiple research papers in peer-reviewed psychology journals. I've served as a peer reviewer in the past, and I'm familiar with statistics in behavioral sciences. While this paper isn't in my exact area of psychology, I'm at least qualified to evaluate the overall quality of the paper, its statistical analyses, and whether its conclusions follow from its methods and results. With that out of the way, let's dive in. First, let's start with some context about this manuscript. This is not a published paper. It has not passed peer review or been published in an academic journal. It's been posted as a preprint on an online repository. Publishing a paper can take a long time, especially in recent years. It's hard to find peer reviewers because they aren't paid for their work, and academics are notoriously slow at tasks that they do agree to complete. Preprints like this are a way of sharing your research while you're waiting for it to get peer reviewed. But they do come with that big red disclaimer of other researchers haven't looked this over yet. So no, it's not settled science. Maybe we could consider it that if it passes peer review, but I don't think that it will, at least not in its current form. Let's talk about why. I'd forgive you if you thought that this paper studied how consuming boys' love, or BL as I'll call it for the rest of this video, relates to young women's sexual orientation. I mean, it's right there in the title. Shaping Sexual Orientation Identity in the Digital Age's Young Females. It's there in the abstract too. To quote, "This study investigates whether immersion in BL culture impacts the process of young females forming self-recognition and identification of sexual orientation." Reading this, I assume they took young women who consume BL and young women who don't consume BL, and then measured and compared their sexual orientation. Or maybe because they're talking about forming of self-recognition and identification of sexual orientation, they did some kind of experimental study to establish causation, that consuming BL caused a change in sexual orientation. They would have to at least measure sexual orientation, right? Well, apparently not, because they sure don't. Despite what it says in the abstract and discussion, this study provides no evidence whatsoever that the consumption of BL is related to sexual orientation in any way. It doesn't even try to. We're going to put a pin in this. We're going to come back to that, but for now, what about gender identity? They mentioned in the introduction of this paper that their statistical analysis showed that their participants' gender identity appeared to be changing. But if you actually go to the results section of this paper, they do not mention gender identity even once. They don't even mention any measures of gender identity or anything related to it in their methods section. So what is this study actually about? Well, that's another part of the abstract. It says that they find that BL fans have significant neural differences from their control group that aren't BL fans. This they can speak to with the data they have, sort of. But does their data support that claim? Well, let's start by looking at the paper. This paper is presented as one study, but I feel like it's a bit more like two different studies. I'll refer to these two studies as Study 1 and Study 2 for simplicity, even though that's not how they're presented in the paper. Both studies are pretty similar. The only thing that changes is the dependent variable. The first independent variable in this study is sort of the key thing. Is this participant a fan of BL or not? I had some questions about this. First, I was wondering what counted as a BL fan. Do these women have to actively seek out BL content, or have they simply consumed any media that had at least one same-sex relationship? It's not clear. They never mention how they measure one of their key independent variables in their methods section. I do want to note that most journals do have a maximum word count, and oftentimes when we're writing these papers, we have to leave out information so that it stays under that word count, or else we can't get it published. But this is the kind of information that you would definitely want to leave in. maybe they could take some of the discussion of variables they didn't measure, like sexual orientation and gender identity, out of their introduction and discussion and use the leftover words to discuss the things that they did measure, like their primary independent variable. Anyway, the second independent variable is the type of pictures participants are looking at. See, the nature of the task is that they sit participants in front of a computer, and then they show them a series of images. Participants are then asked to categorize these images. Now, there are three types of images. The first were BL images. These were live action images of two men in romantic settings. The sample images that they give in the paper are largely two men about to kiss or two men hugging. The second type of images were heterosexual images. These were live action images of a man and a woman in romantic settings. The sample images they give are of a man and a woman holding hands on the beach, a man and a woman getting married, and a man and a woman touching the tips of their fingers together. This might be a cultural thing. I'm not really sure what makes that heterosexual. Finally, the third type of image were mask images. That I'll call, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to call them scrambled images. They were scrambled versions of the BL and heterosexual images that basically look like a bunch of colored squares. They're intended to be neutral images with no sexual or romantic connotations. These images were pre-tested to make sure that the BL and heterosexual images were equally arousing and positive, both for fans of BL and non-fans of BL ahead of time. Participants would view a random image, BL, heterosexual, or scrambled. Then they'd be asked to categorize it as BL, heterosexual, or scrambled. Then there would be a short rest period, and then they'd view another image, and they'd just keep doing that and categorizing these images. They did this for a total of 180 images, 60 of each type. So for study 1, their sample had 139 undergraduate students from a Chinese university, all of which the researchers identify as women. 73 of these people were BL fans, and the other 66 were not. So first, let's talk about study 1's dependent variable. There were actually really effectively two dependent variables in study 1. The first was reaction time. So this was how long it took participants to categorize the image as BL, heterosexual, or scrambled, measured in milliseconds. The second was accuracy. Did they correctly categorize the images? Now, study 2. Study 2 had 31 participants. 17 were BL fans and 14 were not. I will note that 31 is a very small sample size, but this is understandable given that they're doing brain scans. Brain scans cost a lot of money, so usually neuroscience studies and things like this can't have a lot of participants. It's just not within their budget. Now, for the dependent variable for study 2, I want to preface this by saying that I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not terribly familiar with brain scans. I'm going to do my best, though. The researchers used an fMRI, and fMRIs are nice in that they show you both brain activity and the structure of the brain. So this allows you to see both which parts of the brain are lighting up and where exactly those parts are. They measured activity specifically as hemoglobin concentrations. In other words, how much blood oxygen is at a specific area of the brain, and use that as a proxy for how much that area of the brain is being used. This is one way of measuring which parts of the brain are activating in response to stimuli. I say activating broadly speaking because activity is activity. Brain scans cannot read your mind. It doesn't know what thoughts are happening there, and even whether those thoughts are conscious or unconscious. You can't really interpret it other than that this part of the brain is being used. You don't know how it's being used or why it's being used. Hemoglobin levels in the prefrontal cortex are associated with all kinds of things. Whoa. And the authors acknowledge this in the paper. They acknowledge that they are not reading these people's minds and cannot identify exactly what types of thoughts are occurring in this region of the brain. So, what did they find? Well, not much. For reaction time, they find that all participants took longer to categorize BL and heterosexual images compared to the scrambled ones. There was no difference in reaction time for BL and heterosexual images. And there was no difference in reaction time for BL fans and non-fans. So they didn't really find anything with reaction time. Nothing was happening there, regardless of the type of image people were looking at and whether they frequently engaged with BL or not, or whatever they meant when they said BL fans. For accuracy, here they claim that non-BL fans specifically had a harder time recognizing and correctly categorizing BL images than heterosexual images. However, I don't think that they actually found that, and I'll explain why in the next section. Yeah, the statistics they report do seem to support that in some ways, but we'll get into it later. Now, their results for hemoglobin levels. This was their neurological measure that they foreshadow in the title, brain activity. In this case, they do find a significant interaction between whether somebody's a fan of BL and the type of image they're looking at. Image type on its own didn't show any differences in brain activity. So the type of image didn't change which parts of people's brain were lighting up or how much. Being a fan or not on its own, so being a fan of BL or not on its own, did not show any differences in brain activity. But when you combine those two independent variables, there were differences. BL fans exhibited less brain activity than non-fans for BL images, and non-fans had the opposite. They exhibited less brain activity for heterosexual images than the BL fans. This one finding is what their claims of neurological differences between BL fans and non-fans hinges on. This is the significant neural difference they keep talking about all throughout the paper. They refer to this as a disparity and evidence of a profound influence of BL. They say it emerged with pronounced significance. They go further to say that this suggests a deep intertwining of media exposure, cognitive processing, and neurological responses. They are really playing this up. But like their findings with accuracy, I have my doubts about whether this means anything at all or if this finding is even real. So let's talk about how they got these results, statistically speaking. There are some definite issues with the statistics in this paper that mean that I don't think we can trust either of the results that I mentioned above, regardless of how we interpret them. So let's start with that effect of non-BL fans being less accurate at categorizing BL images as compared to heterosexual images. Here's the thing. That finding involves both independent variables. They've found something involving both whether a person is a fan of BL or not, and the type of image they're looking at. Because this involves both independent variables, this is something that statisticians refer to as an interaction. Accuracy or image type depended on whether somebody was a fan or not. But the researchers tested for an interaction before they reported this finding, and that interaction was not significant. They did not find an interaction. Now, at this point, you are supposed to stop. You do not follow this up. Statistics have already told you there's nothing there, so there's nothing there. If you keep looking, you're likely to get a false positive and find something that isn't actually real. But they don't. They kept going and followed up on that non-existent interaction and then interpreted the results of an interaction that they did not find. This is probably a false positive, also known as a type 1 error. We and they cannot conclude that there was any difference in accuracy for different types of images for non-fans despite what they claim in the paper. Hemoglobin levels. So, the results for neuroactivity, aka hemoglobin measures, have a lot of problems before we even get to how they're interpreting them. They looked at the prefrontal cortex, which is a pretty big area of the brain responsible for most conscious thought. They report measuring activity in 20 different parts of the prefrontal cortex, and they call these channels. But they only report results from one of those 20. This suggests to me that they did not find anything in the 19 other areas and only reported the one area where they found something. This would be a bad research practice on a normal day, but it gets worse. Let's talk about something called alpha level. The standard alpha level in psychology is 0.05. What this means is that we're okay with a 5% chance that we would have found those results by coincidence if the null was true. There's a 5% chance that we are getting a false positive, that we concluded something was happening when it wasn't. We think that 5% is a pretty low probability, and normally that's totally fine, but not here. Now, these researchers are very clearly using an alpha of 0.05. Even if 0.05 wasn't the default, you can tell, because they're reporting their p-values as greater than or less than 0.05. So what does that mean, and why do I think this is a huge problem? Well, that means that if there's a 5% error rate, that means 1 in every 20 statistical tests that we do will probably give us a false positive result. It'll say that there's a difference between groups when there actually is no difference. There are methods you can use to reduce the chances of a false positive below 5%, but they didn't use any of those methods for this particular test. But there's only a 5% chance that this is a false positive, right? Wrong. I mentioned earlier about 1 in every 20 statistical tests will give us a false positive. How many brain regions did they look at? Exactly 20. How many brain regions did they find a difference in? Exactly 1. I can't guarantee that this was a false positive, but it's not looking good, especially given their small sample size for study 2 of only 31 people. See, the type of statistics that they were using only really work when you have a minimum of 30 people per between subjects condition. In this study, their between subjects conditions are whether somebody is a BL fan or not. They have 17 people in one condition and 14 in the other. Their sample size does not meet the minimum standard for using this type of statistics. They're at roughly half of the minimum. This isn't uncommon in neurological studies given how much brain scans cost, but given everything else that's going on, it's definitely worrying. Those neurological differences they keep hyping up all over the paper may not exist at all. The fact that they even found any could very well just be a meaningless coincidence. Does it matter that they didn't measure sexual orientation or gender identity at any point? Not really, because I don't think any of the results in this paper are solid enough to mean anything, even if they had measured those things. Now, the paper isn't all that there is. I mentioned earlier that a lot of journals have a maximum word count for papers in their journal. This means that authors need to leave some information out of their papers to make sure they're not too long to publish, which leads us to something called the supplemental material. This is a document or set of documents that can contain as much or as little additional information about the studies that the authors want to provide. This paper has a supplement associated with it. Now, I do really want to emphasize that most people who read a journal article will never so much as sneeze in the direction of this supplement. Hell, most people reading a paper won't even read the entire paper, much less check if it has a supplement. Even peer reviewers might not even glance at the supplement unless there's something they really want clarification about. But I read the supplement because I care about y'all, and also I was kind of curious. So what additional information did it have? Well, for one, it describes the pilot study they used to determine which images to use in the studies presented in the main paper itself. And get this, in that pilot study, they actually ask participants about their sexual orientation. They do. Unlike in the studies in the actual paper that is ostensibly about sexual orientation, they ask about gender and sexuality here. I'm honestly at kind of a loss. I have so many questions. So this wasn't just a normal pilot study to determine which images to use. It's pretty much another study entirely where they do a bunch of exploratory analyses. I have no idea why they put this in the supplemental material that most people will never bother to open, much less read. This seems like it's what they wanted the paper to be about. Why did they put it here? They measure attitudes towards gay men and lesbians using a scale tailored to Chinese cultural context that their participants are living in. They measure participants' satisfaction with their gender identity, attitudes towards BL fans, and a lot of other things that feel a bit less relevant, like the educational attainment of the participants' parents. There doesn't seem to be any kind of theory or hypothesis guiding this, but that's okay. Exploratory research is fine so long as it's followed up by confirmatory work, which they don't do here, but they can do that in later papers. This could be a whole program of research. And they find a lot of things. Compared to people who aren't fans of BL, Chinese BL fans have more educated parents, plan to get married later in life, think it's more important that women also get to enjoy sex, have more positive attitudes towards gay individuals of any gender, and want to be friends with other BL fans more than non-BL fans do. And here's the big claims about gender and sexual orientation. This is where they come in. Chinese BL fans were more likely than non-fans to report that they did not identify as heterosexual, that their gender identity did not match their sex assigned at birth, that they'd be willing to and even like to transition, and generally express more support for trans men specifically. They didn't look at support for trans women. There doesn't appear to be any difference in actual sexual behavior between BL fans and non-fans. They found no evidence that BL fans were more likely to have had sex regardless of the gender of their partner, nor that they were having sex with more partners than non-fans. They also expressed wanting to have a similar number of children as non-fans. So they did find differences, but claiming that BL caused these differences is a huge leap. This is not an experimental study. It cannot establish that one thing caused another. It honestly, at least to me, seems more probable that the people who already live in an accepting environment and identify with the LGBTQ plus community would be more likely to seek out BL rather than the other way around. The authors themselves hint at this in the supplement. They note that, compared to non-fans, the BL fans in their sample were more likely to live in cities. I'm mostly familiar with research in US contexts, but cities tend to be liberal areas, and liberals tend to have more positive and open attitudes towards LGBTQ plus individuals and content. BL fans' parents were also highly educated, which tends to be associated with more liberal views in the US at least. The causal variable here, leading to both BL enjoyment and identifying as part of the LGBTQ plus community, may just be that these people grew up in a more liberal, accepting environment. There's way too many plausible alternate explanations for these results to claim that BL reading caused people to sort of become dissatisfied with their gender identity or stop identifying as heterosexual. There's way too many third variables, other things going on here. So moving on from the specifics, there's some other miscellaneous things that bugged me about this paper. These things might very well just mean nothing. They could just be little errors and things like that. Everybody makes mistakes, it happens. But they did confuse me. The first weird thing is, why did they put everything about sexual orientation and gender identity in the supplement? They titled and wrote the paper as if it was studying those things, but they do absolutely nothing with them in any of the studies they report in the main paper. At first I thought they hadn't even looked at them at all. I had to do a lot of adding to and editing the script once I looked at the supplement. It completely changed my perception of this entire project. Why did they hide it? Why did they make themselves look bad to people who were just reading the article? What is going on? There has to be a story here. The second thing is internal inconsistencies. The most obvious is that they spend a lot of the title, abstract, introduction, and discussion talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, but they don't measure any of those things in the studies they report in the main paper. They're trying to make a claim that they never could have possibly even tested with the data that they show us there. It's weird. A second, less obvious one, and this is kind of nitpicky, is that their results change between the introduction and the results section. In the introduction, they claim there was no difference in activation, like neuronal activation for BL fans and not for BL images versus heterosexual images, but that there was a difference for non-BL fans. They state something different than what they found in the results, which was that there was also a difference for BL fans. These two things can't be true. Only one of them can be true. One of them has to be incorrect. I think that this might be just a typo or a mistake. I think they probably just mixed up the accuracy results with the hemoglobin results. It could also suggest that they've done their analyses in several different ways while writing the paper and only mentioned the way they thought told the best story in the final draft, but honestly, I just think the honest mistake is probably the more plausible explanation. These papers go through a lot of drafts and, like, weird things happen. The third weird thing is the list of institutional affiliations of the authors. Now, it's standard practice on any journal article to list all the authors and their institutional affiliations, in other words, the universities or companies that they're associated with at the top of the article. This paper has 6 authors listed and 3 universities listed. 5 of the 6 authors are affiliated with Henan University in China. 1 is affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania in the US. And wait, why is New York University listed here? None of the 6 authors listed are affiliated with New York University according to the list. I've Googled all of these authors, and I can't find any evidence that any of them were ever affiliated with NYU. I see 2 possible explanations for this. The first, well, both of them involve there being a 7th researcher on the team. The first is that this 7th researcher from NYU was removed as an author. This would typically happen because this person said they were going to work on the project and then they didn't, you know, like that one member of any group project that just doesn't do any work. This isn't common, but it's not unusual either. I have had to do this before, and so it's entirely plausible that that's what's happened. The second explanation is that there was a 7th researcher from NYU affiliated with the project who asked to be removed from the paper. This is pretty rare. Having your name on as many papers as you can is good for getting jobs and getting promoted in academia. You'd only want to have your name taken off a paper if, one, you don't feel like you contributed enough to deserve it, or two, you didn't trust the results of the paper or how they were presented and therefore didn't want to be associated with it. It's weird. All right, so a lot of people were criticizing this paper on Twitter, and some of those critiques were fair. I think other of those critiques were not that fair. Not because these people were doing these critiques in bad faith, but because they were lacking certain knowledge about how psychological research and publishing works. One Twitter user stated that the grammar and spelling mistakes in this paper are a red flag and that the authors don't know what they're talking about. This is not the case. Most of the authors, and most of the authors who specifically did the writing and editing on this paper, are from China and work at a Chinese university. Chinese is likely their first language, with English as a second language learned later on in life. The sad truth of the matter is that English is the de facto international language of psychology. Even if you're not fluent, you have to communicate in English if you want to contribute to the overall literature about psychology. This is hard! Did you ever have to write a research paper in college? Do you remember how hard that was? Now imagine that you have to do it in a second language. That is the task that these researchers are undertaking. They had a rough job set in front of them, and really, it's not the grammar that matters. The science, the methods, the statistics, those are what matter for the quality of the paper, not the grammar that it's presented with, as long as you can understand it, you know. Another Twitter user posted a screenshot of the conflict of interest section of this paper that said there was no conflicts of interest and suggested that the authors were lying. I think this is a basic misunderstanding of what a conflict of interest is as far as scientific papers are concerned. And trust me, I get it. If I had my way, people would list their personal biases in this section, but that's just not what this section is for. In academic publishing, this section is strictly for listing financial conflicts of interest with funding for the study. For example, if an anti-LGBTQ+ group had funded this research, or a pro-LGBTQ+ group had funded this research, or a publishing company that primarily prints BL, or whatever it is, they would have had to list that there. It doesn't seem like there was any funding from any similar groups like that, so they didn't have to list anything. As far as the journals they're submitting to are concerned, they don't have a conflict of interest. Whether that's how this thing should be done, but that's how it is done. This is normal. That was not a lie. I have seen accusations that these authors are homophobic, transphobic. I do not think that the authors were being intentionally malicious. There's certainly some language in here, and I understand why that perception exists. But I will say, if you read through the paper, the authors mention in several places that the increasing prevalence of BL in China may be a good thing, and it's providing representation for underrepresented groups, which they say is a good thing. Of course, they say this in between saying that BL should be age-restricted to protect the children, and that we must protect growing brains from being molded by BL, but they do say it. In the supplemental material, they go even further and actively say that they think it would be good if more progressive, accepting places and areas grew, that areas that were more accepting of LGBTQ individuals became more common and larger in China, and they even advocate for the inclusion of discussion of BL media in educational curriculum. I do think there's some other things in this paper that I wouldn't agree with, but they don't seem entirely malicious. I just think that given the Chinese government's anti-LGBTQ+ policies, the authors are embedded in a culture where these issues are spoken about in a very specific way, and there are cultural expectations of how people should discuss these issues. Perhaps that they should discuss them as a problem that needs to be addressed. These authors are just using language that they hear from the powers that be, is my perception of what's going on here. I want you to remember, no one is immune to the environment that they live in. Not even you or me. All right, criticism 3. This is one where I think this criticism is just off the mark. They say that there were only 30 people studied in this entire paper. This is wrong. I mean, it is right that these samples were small. In fact, study 2 samples was only 31 people. I think that's the number that they're referring to here. And these samples were biased, given that the 2 studies presented in the main paper are specifically undergraduate students at one very specific Chinese university. But there were definitely more than 30 participants in this paper. There were a total of about 180 participants across both studies in the main paper total. That's still not great, but they did use a within subjects variable in their design for the picture ratings, which helps them make up for that small sample size quite a bit. It's not nearly as bad as this Twitter user is making it out to be. Once again, the supplemental material, I think, is particularly useful. The study in the supplement, where they found those differences between BL fans and non-fans, had 1,143 participants. That is not a small sample size. It's certainly not the biggest I've seen, but that's still a pretty decent sample size. And those participants weren't just restricted to college students, though they were still pretty young on average. So that's it. The main paper does not speak to whether liking BL is at all related to sexual orientation and gender identity, despite what the title, abstract, introduction, and discussion may lead you to believe. The title, the abstract, the discussion, the introduction, all of them are filled with a lot of speculation without data to back them up. I feel like they're treating the entire paper as kind of like a future directions section rather than discussing what they actually did this time. They're more like, we think that these would be questions that we should look at or things that might be true, but they don't actually have any evidence for the vast majority of the claims or propositions that they make in this paper. The supplement does suggest there is some relationship between liking BL and sexual orientation and gender identity, but all of the data and findings there are correlational, and they do have a biased sample. This was a very young sample. The average age was about 21, and most of their BL fans were from the city, whereas most of their non-fans were from the country, which is a confound. Their 2 groups are different based on where they live and not just based on whether they like BL or not. There do seem to be some attitudinal differences about sexuality and gender differences between BL fans and non-fans in this supplement, and that is interesting. Again, it's all correlational, so there's no evidence that consuming BL caused those differences. They might just as well have found those differences because a certain demographic of people happen to be drawn to BL, you know? The main paper, I would say, is kind of a giant nothing. It doesn't, I don't feel like I learned anything from it. The supplement does have potential, though, but in the supplement, they are inferring causation from correlation, which is something that you should not do, and it's all exploratory. They had no reason to expect these things. They just kind of went out and saw what happened. Now, I do hope that my viewers wouldn't do this, but please do not contact or harass any of the researchers. I doubt that this was intentional or malicious. I think there was just a lot of mistakes made along the way, and everyone makes mistakes. That's why peer review exists. That's why this article may be going through peer review. If they want to get it published, it'll have to go through peer review. And I severely doubt it will make it past peer review for all the reasons that I've listed above. So don't attack the authors. They don't deserve it. And this paper probably isn't going to be published anyway, at least in its current form, without some major rewrites. So there you go. That is my general thoughts of They Scanned Fujoshi's Brain paper. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you next class.